Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of 2020 Vision, the VOD Talk News Magazine programme. I hope you had a happy Christmas and are enjoying your festive season. I hope it's going well quietly and that you're safe and healthy. And tonight we're going to just take a moment out and we're going to give you a briefing on something that will be in the news very early in the new year. And we're going to look at the case of Julian Assange. I'm sure you've heard of him, but we're going to look at the story in more detail. I'm Jenny Fisher, the editor of East London News, and we've got three guests with us tonight. When I first mentioned to some friends of mine on a WhatsApp group, we were going to be looking at the case of Julian Assange tonight, one of them wrote back, "Oh, Jenna, you think you're getting involved in a bit of hacking then?" And immediately that reminded me how the story may be well known, but the detail is not. Because Julian Assange is not a hacker, he's a journalist. And to introduce that story, I'm going to ask Helen Mercer, a campaigner from the Julian Assange Defence Committee, to talk for a little bit and just set the scene for us on what Wikileaks is and the role that Julian played. Throughout this, we've got another guest with us, Maxine Walker, who's also from the Julian Assange Defence Committee. I think in a couple of places we may have written down that she was from somewhere else. That's not the case. Both of them are campaigners from the Julian Assange Defence Committee. And in a little while, as we get into the programme, Bob Gill, Dr. Bob Gill, will be speaking as well. He's a member of Doctors for Assange, but more of him later. Helen, welcome to the programme. And would you like to set the scene for us?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Jenny and East London News, for inviting us. It's a very important time to be discussing this. On the 4th of January, we'll hear the decision of Judge Barretza on whether or not Assange is to be extradited. So I suppose the question I wanted to sort of just lead off with was, well, what has Wikileaks done? What does it represent? Why is it important to be defending Wikileaks and Julian Assange? Briefly, it's published Wikileaks has published over 10 million documents, the truth and accuracy of which has never been challenged. So unlike many of the sort of revelations of the mainstream media, which sometimes appear not to be quite what they are, turn out not to be quite what they appear, it has a perfect verification record. What does Wikileaks try to do? What is it about these documents that's significant? And I think it's maybe best summed up in the words of Julian Assange himself. First of all, I think it's about exposing war crimes, the abuse of power, corruption. Famously, one of Assange's statements is that if war can be started with lies, then peace starts with the truth. And so it's trying to put out the truth about the nature of modern war.
Can I just stop you there a second, Helen?
Yes.
I'm having some trouble hearing you. I think this is actually maybe my fault. Can everybody else hear Helen?
I heard interference.
I had
okay.
interference, yeah, but it's not from my end.
Okay, right. Sorry to interrupt you. Carry on, Helen.
That's okay. So if war can be started with lies, then peace begins with the truth, and it's about putting out the truth about the nature of wars. But I think he was going rather further than that. In one of the very last interviews he gave, before he was whisked off to Belmarsh, he says he started WikiLeaks in order to know the fate of man. And by that, what he meant that it was about exposing and showing how man's institutions work, how our modern institutions work, and by showing how it works, by showing what we can expect of the future and how we can perhaps influence the future. So, I mean, then the concrete revelations, well, there are so many of them, and I'll just go through some of them. And I think, Maxine, you're going to weigh in a little bit. One of the most significant and earliest ones, the ones that really grabbed attention, was what was called the Collateral murder video. And this essentially is a video. It's available on YouTube. There are various, if you type Collateral murder video into YouTube, you'll find lots of examples of it. And it shows killings in cold blood of Iraqi Syrians, including of a young Reuters journalist. That's basically what it showed. Would you like to come in here at this stage, Maxine, and just tell us in more detail what that video is actually about?
Yes, I mean, can I say first that you can find this video very easily on YouTube if you just Google Collateral murder. And what we witness in that, and I think a lot of people have seen it, and it made a huge impression on them. What we witness is a war crime taking place before our eyes. It shows the murder of over a dozen civilians in a suburb of Baghdad in 2007. And amongst the dead were 2 Reuters news staff, and others were wounded, including 2 small children who were seriously wounded. That video, I think, was a similar in reaction to the defining video of the Vietnam War, which was the little girl who running away from a village who had been burned very, very severely by napalm dropped by the US war machine. And in the Collateral murder video, we see a helicopter, an Apache helicopter. We see the view from their camera, what they're looking at. Their call sign was Crazy Horse 18. And we hear them talking to each other. And they convince themselves that one of the crowd that they can see, a small crowd, a small group of men, have an RPG, a rocket-propelled launcher, and they decide, and then they seek permission from their commanders to shoot on the crowd, and they shoot with a rotating 30mm cannon from the helicopter straight into the group of men, and you see them scatter, you see them fall, you see them die. It's a horrifying spectacle. And equally horrifying is hearing the crew's conversation where they say things like, "Oh, great, nice, good shot. Oh yeah, look at that dead bastard. Haha, I got him." So that was the conversation they were having. Now, one of the Reuters news staff, Saeed, was wounded but moving, and they keep urging him to pick up the gun. Go on, pick up a gun. Go on, pick up a gun, so that they could shoot him. Then a van comes, and much as you or I would if we saw a group of stricken people in the street, stopped to try and help them. In fact, the driver of that van, who was killed later, was taking his children to school. And they get out of the van to try and pick up the wounded and get them to hospital. And and this is the definitive war crime. The helicopter then decides to fire on the van and the people picking up the wounded, and the driver is killed, and his 2 children are severely wounded. And the crew can be heard saying it's their fault for bringing their children to a battle. Now, there hadn't been a battle. There was nothing going on except a group of men talking to each other. Nobody was ever prosecuted for this incident, and the film was only ever seen because WikiLeaks released it. It caused a huge sensation across the world, largely because I think people don't know what warfare is. They don't really usually see it like that. They see it very perfumed and on film. They don't see the reality of it, but there you saw it. And at the trial, at the extradition hearing recently, the bureau chief from Reuters came and testified for Julian Assange and against his extradition, and talked about how he'd been lied to about what happened on that day when his 2 staff members were killed, and lied to by the military, and said that he said I know that Saeed and Namir would have remained forgotten statistics in the war that killed countless human beings, hundreds of thousands of people, had it not been for Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. The truth of what happened on that street in Baghdad would never have been known.
You make a very, very powerful case, Helen. I mean, we did consider whether we could broadcast this video as part of this programme. In the end, we decided that really, because news outlets do have to abide by certain rules and requirements, that we wouldn't show it ourselves. And we do have to warn people watching it that, as Helen spelled out, the video does show people being killed, and in a very violent manner, and it can be very upsetting to watch. So please be warned about the content of that video. But you've described it to us, Helen, and you've also sort of really put it in a very important context, I think, of which shows just how important this kind of coverage and this kind of action is. I mean, I think we all probably remember as well when the Blair government first began the war on Afghanistan and then the war on Iraq, and tried to justify their actions. I think we all remember the dodgy dossier, and were it not for the fact that the magnificent Glenn Rangwala from Cambridge University recognised the supposed dossier full of facts from MI5 as a student essay that had been knocking around for a while, and Glenn was able to expose that. And so, shocking as this one incident is, it's not alone, is it? It can't be.
No. It's in fact it's one of so many. And I mean, I'll just go through a few more of the basic releases that there have been. Much of it, some of the most important material, was deposited with WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning, who herself has endured torture and imprisonment in the United States as well, as a result of what she deposited with WikiLeaks. So I mean, following on from that, various other releases. One of them is called the Iraq War Logs. Now, the Iraq War Logs document over 100,000 civilian killings related to the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq by British and US troops in 2003. And it has allowed that particular releases have allowed a body count, particularly of civilians killed during in the process of invasion and occupation. So that's another set of publications. Another set relates to the war in Afghanistan, the Afghan War Diary, which covers 91,000 reports, which collectively describe in a very sort of forensic, clinical way that one military man will talk to another. They describe lethal military actions undertaken by the United States between 2004 and 2010. Allowing a detailed body count both of combatants and non-combatants, that is civilians. There's also what's known as the Gitmo trial, the Gitmo files. So these provide standing operating procedures used at the infamous Guantanamo detention camp. And these files document the handling of prisoners at the camp. We know these prisoners were illegally detained, often through rendition process, with which many countries are complicit as well. These documents show that many of these prisoners were assessed as not posing a threat to the United States security, but they were still detained for very long periods. And one person in particular was being used more to inform on the other on other prisoners, or to inform on other people. So there's some of the releases. I mean, I can go on. Can I go on?
Yes.
Any, or stop for a minute?
No, let's stop for a minute now. And I just want to remind our audience in the UK, this, of course, was these actions were all being done and supported by your money, dear taxpayer, even if we're not the USA ourselves. There's no doubt the UK was very much supporting the USA in its actions overseas, and the special relationship has consequences, and you're paying for it. It's being done in your name, which is why we're very pleased to bring this program to you. So, having sort of set out our stall for what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were actually doing, we need to turn to the consequences. We are broadcasting live, so you can ring in if you've got any questions, and I'm sure Helen and Maxine will be pleased to answer them if you want to talk any more about other aspects of the case, if you want more examples. But perhaps if we could at this point sort of slightly go out of chronological order and perhaps come to Bob and say, Bob, can you explain why it is that you as a GP, why you're as a doctor, been drawn into this campaign, and what can you tell us about Julian Assange's medical condition after his 7 years in sanctuary in the Ecuadorian embassy and his subsequent arrest, and he's now in Belmarsh? What can you tell us, Bob?
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I've been a GP, but also an NHS campaigner, because what I've been focusing my activist energy on is to try and highlight public awareness of the stealth privatization of our health service. So I have personal experience of how mainstream media is not there to inform the public, but to shape a narrative and to manufacture a common understanding which fits in with what the establishment want the public to believe. And I had a sort of a sideways interest on what was happening with WikiLeaks and Snowden and Julian Assange, and certainly the revelations that they exposed to the world were very powerful indeed. They were shared by many media outlets. And let's not forget, Julian Assange was a journalistic and publishing hero in the eyes of everybody for a while. But it was almost a decade ago where he expressed thoughts that the United States wanted to extradite him. And this wasn't taken seriously until there started an effort to smear his reputation. And these are on the back of some allegations. Now, I want to make clear, he was never charged with sexual crimes. They were allegations. And at that point, he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. And as you rightly say, in April of last year, he was dragged out of the embassy, and it became clearer to many more people, although it wasn't widely covered in mainstream media again, that there were clearly his fears about extradition were well-founded. Now, having spent the best part of a decade essentially with his freedom denied, unable to do fully the groundbreaking work he was doing, and then later on finding not only was he confined to the embassy, but gradually his freedoms even in there were restricted. He lost access to using the internet. And when the government changed, then that was the green light for this manhandling and brutal extraction from the embassy. Now, my at that point, I started to take a greater interest. I attended a couple of meetings. I knew Helen from other campaigning, from NHS campaigning, and I was invited to be part of the Doctors for Assange group. And I was happy to sign the letter that they produced, which was trying to highlight, based on the evidence we have from renowned people like Professor Helen Mercer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, was convinced that this man languishing in Belmarsh was being tortured, psychologically tortured, in a way that leaves no physical marks, because the West still has to endeavor to maintain a veneer of respectability. So they have been engaging for almost 2 years in the psychological torture of Assange in a maximum security prison where he spends 23 out of 24 hours a day locked up, essentially in solitary confinement, with no association with other prisoners, and having no internet access, being blocked access from his legal team, and minimal contact with friends and family, minimal physical contact with friends and family.
Yes,
Now,
I mean,
as a GP, I see on a daily basis the impact of 1 or 2 individual psychological insults on my patients, and they cast a very long shadow potentially. But Julian Assange has endured a decade of psychological insults, which have only been ratcheted up, and I suppose reached the crescendo with the court case, which from the readings I've done, I've not seen Julian Assange or visited him, but from the reading I've done of reporting from people like John Pilger, Craig Murray, and other reporters who bravely being few and far between, the picture they paint of Julian Assange's mental state and the evidence given by the specialists who appeared in court on his behalf for the defense made it clear that he was showing many of the signs of a torture victim, being unable to remember his name at one point. Some of the evidence highlighted that he was found in possession of a sharp implement, a knife, I believe, for which he was taken into the hospital wing of Belmarsh prison. And he also at one stage was experiencing auditory hallucinations, which are symptoms of a psychotic episode, the extreme end of depression. And just to quote what Professor Michael Kopelman said in court, was he believed that in the event of the imminent extradition, Mr. Assange would indeed find a way to commit suicide. So the evidence outlined in court and from reliable testimony from friends, journalists, and supporters is clear to me that the evidence we have is of somebody who has not been shown fair process, who's been part of a show trial, the purpose of which is to persecute him and to send a chilling effect across journalism around the world that you must not expose the crimes of Western states, because this is the penalty that awaits you.
yes, I mean, we're concentrating very much on Julian Assange tonight and his case, but a spin-off of his how he's being treated is the deterrent factor, isn't it? That it's there not only to punish Assange, but also to discourage anyone else who may feel compelled to whistleblow or to publish allegations or information that other people are putting out. So it's big though the case is, it's really implications are much bigger. And of course, particularly when you talk about the British state, Jules, British freedoms, British traditions, innocent until proven guilty. And although the extradition hearing is a kind of a trial, really, these are still allegations being put about Assange, aren't they? He's not actually been through a substantive trial yet. Helen and Maxine, have you followed the trial? What do you think came out of it? The extradition trial.
I think the extradition hearings, I think they were an extraordinary array of witnesses testifying on Julian Assange's behalf. People like Chomsky, people like Daniel Ellsberg, renowned professors of media matters, doctors, all sorts of people. There was one person who testified, Helen Mercer, who was a victim of rendition and a torture, and used one of the WikiLeaks cables to show that the USA, which acts as an absolute bully on every level, had leaned and threatened the German government in various ways to stop them taking any action on behalf of al-Musri, who was a German citizen when he was rendered by the CIA and tortured. So I think the point that Bob made about the media is very, very important, because I know when I started campaigning and handing out leaflets in various places, I got a profoundly bad reaction in some cases, very aggressive reaction. And these were things like outside Labour Party meetings. This wasn't anywhere else. And I think the media has created, and I think The Guardian has played a leading role in this, has created a picture of Assange as a narcissist. You often hear him called a narcissist. No, how would anybody know that? Yeah, I hear it said. A hacker, some kind of sex thing in Sweden, which actually was part of the US plan, really, that Sweden collaborated with to detain Assange in the embassy for, they carried on that investigation for 9 years. They never got beyond the stage of a preliminary investigation. And Niels Meltzer, yeah. Sorry.
Also, they didn't take up the opportunity to come and interview Assange on
they
British
resisted
soil, did
it.
they?
They resisted it. In fact, we've got correspondence now that a journalist got from Freedom of Information requests showing that the British Crown Prosecution Service was absolutely urging them to delay matters as long as possible. And when Sweden said, look, we think we're going to have to drop this because it was becoming embarrassing for them after several years, the CPS wrote to them and said, don't you dare get cold feet. This was the CPS of Britain in collaboration, I'm sure, with authorities in the USA. So Sweden was just an excuse, really. The prolonging of that case was an excuse to keep him tied down. And when Wikileaks itself revealed in one of the cables that a private intelligence firm that works with the CIA and other agencies was talking about what they could do to get him after the releases. And they actually say, and this is ferreting out his confederates is also key. Find out what other disgruntled rogues inside the tent there are. Pile on, move him from country to country to face various charges for the next 25 years. Seize everything he and his family own. That was the plan. Sweden was part of the plan.
It's a sort of obverse of collective punishment, isn't it? We've all sort of, when we've been looking at the Middle East, come to terms with this idea of collective punishment is, potentially a war crime and so on. And this is sort of the other way around. It's punish before trial of an individual to put the lid on a whole mass movement, isn't it? I think I'd like to, if I can, just sort of bring out one particular point here. So I think quite often people believe that Assange published information which put US agents and possibly civilians or perhaps military personnel at risk of injury or death from retaliation. But when we were preparing this program, you sent me a very interesting link. Something else that's publicly available on the internet is a tape of a phone call that Assange made to the US State Department. Again, we considered playing it here, but I'm just going to put the link up on the comments box underneath the video, so you can listen to it after the program, because it's a good listen. I found it very interesting and informative, but it's a little bit slow because it's an ordinary conversation. It's not fast, so we didn't want to interrupt this program with it. But do listen to it afterwards, dear viewer. Because in it you could hear, I thought what was very telling was Assange revealing that he had been trying to get the US government to listen to his information, which was that a lot of WikiLeaks material had been stolen, and he feared someone else was going to put it on the internet. WikiLeaks had been intending to redact it. So I don't know, Helen or Maxine, if you're able to talk about that. Well, I put the link up for the phone call that Assange made. We need to get it completely right. it was WikiLeaks was intending to redact the material, wasn't it? And
yes,
again,
WikiLeaks was intending to redact the material, and a journalist who had been employed by WikiLeaks previously had access to the same material and was planning to put it was planning to release it, but without, as far as they were aware, without redacting it. And Assange attempted to alert the State Department to the possibility of unredacted material, which might reveal the names of and identities of individuals. He attempted to alert the State Department to the fact that this was about to happen. He tried to get through to them for a day, he says in this video, and then he finally got through to one of the State Department lawyers. But as far as we know, no action was taken. But then WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and during the hearings in September, they tried to make out that this was the fault of WikiLeaks, when actually it was not the fault of WikiLeaks. It was the fault of a rogue journalist. But also, of course, it was the fault of one of the Guardian journalists, who, in a book that was published, revealed the password to the unredacted documents.
How strange. Can you account for that at all? How this might have happened? I mean, again, we don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but are these just unfortunate accidents, or this is all again part of a campaign to discredit WikiLeaks?
Well, certainly it's been shown, it was shown in the Chelsea Manning trial, where the USA could not come up with a single example of anybody who had been harmed by WikiLeaks. At the extradition hearings, journalists who worked with Assange said how impatient they sometimes got because of his redaction process. He was very, very careful to protect individual names. And as Helen said, somebody stole the cache of cables, but they couldn't do anything with it because there was a very, very complex encryption password on that file. And the two journalists from The Guardian, Luke Harding and David Lee, used the password that had been given to them in confidence by Assange as a kind of subheading in that book. And the computer hackers around the world spotted it.
Yes.
And that's what Assange was warning the State Department of, and was very clearly trying to help prevent any harm. He had a very, very strong harm minimization process. So again, what I found over and over again when I was learning about this case is that what you've heard is not just not true, it's the exact opposite of the truth. The exact opposite of the truth. They invert it.
Yeah. And I think that tape is a very, very important one, because it really blows a hole in a lot of the prosecution's case at the hearings. Because one of the elements of their case is that he endangered people's lives. That tape just puts an end to that particular allegation, in my view. I'm not a lawyer, but that would be, in my view, it just puts an end to that allegation.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think some of your material was saying that that's that point should be put at any US hearing. So were either of you able to attend the trial? The extradition hearing? Were any of you able to go to that?
Well, therein lies a tale, because the extradition hearing, itself was so. First of all, quite a few NGOs like Reporters Without Borders and Amnesty International, who often attend as observers at trials that are potentially very, very serious for human rights and so on, were accepted as observers at the trial. They put in the paperwork and they were due to go in. On the first day of the trial, that judgment was reversed by Judge Baretza, who said that that wasn't going to happen. They weren't being given the status of observers. And in fact, they then found it incredibly difficult to get in because the COVID situation has given the courts many excuses not to cooperate with in terms of the public gallery, for instance. I think they could only have a few people in there at that. And often we found throughout the case that the video links and the sound for the journalists who might be watching from a room in the court don't work. Often they just don't work at all. So they've had lots of technical difficulties. In fact, that meant, and Reporters Without Borders have been very, very vocal about this. They said that they have found it easier to observe in Turkish courtrooms than they have in this British case. It is astonishing the lack of legal rights that Julian Assange, the legal rights that have been abused in the case of Julian Assange. I mean, we haven't touched on the fact, for instance, that when he was in the embassy, the last part of his stay in the embassy, he was observed 24 hours a day. This came out again via a witness at the trial and previously, that the security company there was filming him 24 hours a day and taking the phones of his visitors and dismantling them and finding out what was on them. So that this was video and audio 24 hours a day. They had the bathroom with a camera in it. They had fire extinguishers with cameras in them. And an employee from that company spoke about that. And it's clear that that was done at the behest of the CIA and private companies working with them. So, that was one thing that came out at the trial, but the observers had a very difficult job getting in. We had to queue supporters outside, queued every day from 5 or 6 a.m. to make sure one or two of them could get in.
And I think we also need to mention the way in which Assange was treated at that trial himself.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, throughout the trial, he was behind a glass barrier, found it very, very difficult to communicate with his lawyers. He had to pass notes to the lawyers, had to lean forward to pass notes, found it very difficult to hear what was going on a lot of the time. He was handcuffed and strip searched every time on his way to the court and back from the court, and had files taken away from him so that he couldn't follow his own case. I mean, the miscarriage of justice in this particular case is quite astounding. And was
there any reason given for the strip searching? I mean, officially.
Well, they're treating him as guilty. They're treating him, as there is no reason. There is no valid reason for that. I'm sure
there's no valid reason.
There can be no valid reason.
I'm sure there's no valid reason. I was just wondering, whether they try to justify it, because I don't think that's something. I think that's something we learnt many years ago in sort of watching Irish prisoners at the hands of British legal system, judicial system, wasn't it? So many Irish prisoners would say the constant strip searching was all part of a campaign to humiliate and denigrate and keep up the psychological pressure that Bob was talking about.
Yeah.
Bob, have I read as well that Julian Assange actually does have some respiratory ailment and that COVID is actually breaking out in Belmarsh? It's not under control there. Have you followed that at all?
Yeah, so there's no detail on it. There has been reported he does have an underlying respiratory condition. There's no detail on what that is, but clearly anybody with an underlying medical problem, poorly nourished, no fresh air, poor ventilation, kept in a freezing prison, being denied even wearing winter clothing, having to block the window with books just to try and conserve heat. And we're hearing the wing that he's been held on, COVID positive other prisoners are being moved into that wing, potentially further increasing the risk of spread to Julian. So the COVID is an additional threat to his health, but so is the general environment with which he's been kept in and the lack of association with other prisoners. And let's not forget, he's not been convicted of anything, and he's being kept in a prison, maximum security prison, with murderers and people convicted of terrorism and very heinous crimes. So he was arrested because of breach of his bail conditions. That time has been served, yet he still remains languishing in Belmarsh. It's quite outrageous, really.
Thank you for that. And while the trial's been going on, and you've described how difficult it's been sort of getting in and following it, nonetheless, there has still been campaigning, hasn't there? You sent us again a link to a video on YouTube, which we would have loved to have played, out this program with this beautiful song. But there's YouTube and copyright reasons why we couldn't. Again, I'll post the link on the comments box. So you actually had a gospel choir go down to Belmarsh to sing, to remind the public of Julian's incarceration there. And again, it's a funny YouTube to watch, because it begins with this stern reminder that, oh, you can't, yes, they may be singing, but you can't film them because they're near Belmarsh. You know, what is the world coming to? So what, and I think, Helen, you've, or Maxine, I think you've got some other things that people can do to support Julian Assange. So what have you been doing apart from the singing?
Well, obviously campaigning has been circumscribed by the COVID regulations. Currently, and I don't know how many people know this, for the tier 4 areas, they are literally allowing no protest to take place, even if they're socially distanced, even if you're masked. They some very sturdy campaigners have been going out and have been being arrested or detained at various venues. So that the campaign has continued online and on the streets where it can, but it is a difficult situation because the police, for instance, come very quickly. We had the riot squad come to supporters who were at Piccadilly with banners and detain some of them, or at least force them out and chase them out. So that's been difficult, but there are things that can be done. The first thing I would say is, if you don't know much about the case, go and read as much as you can. Look at the Wikileaks site. Go on to the Wikileaks site and look at some of the material there. It's I always find it quite thrilling to go on that site because of the nature of what is revealed there. I mean, from very big things, the war crimes, to other things. You know, the fact that the cables revealed, for instance, that and it was confirmed later that Angela Merkel's phone had been bugged by the USA since 2002.
Yes. You just thought it should be great. It should be grateful to know that, to find that out, wouldn't you?
But also that they had Hillary Clinton had requested all sorts of details to be found on UN officials, including their biometric and financial data. So when the USA talks about other states interfering in its processes, the USA is not only fomenting coups and interfering all over the place and waging war against people, it's also spying on its own allies and bullying and blackmailing them. Because
and I tell you something else. I bet even if the Brits think that they're okay because they've got a special relationship, I bet they're being spied on as well. I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Maxine, in this. We can come back to some of the things that that people can do, just to remind people that if they would like to ring into the studio and ask you a question, then they can ring in direct on 0208 1234507. But the other way of asking a question is to comment on our live stream, which Adam Koppel has actually done. And Adam's question is, has Keir Starmer ever been challenged on how much he knew? Starmer was, of course, in charge of the CPS at one stage. I don't know if either of you can answer that as to whether Keir Starmer was involved at all in this case.
My understanding is that he was the head of the CPS at the time that Maxine was talking about, when the CPS were complicit with the Swedish government and thereby with the American government to keep him holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. Whether anybody has actually ever directly challenged him on it, I don't know.
I mean, it is interesting when we talk about that, because I find it inconceivable that the head of the CPS dealing with this case, such a high-profile case, wouldn't have known everything that was going on. Most of the emails that the CPS sent were destroyed. They literally destroyed them. And they were, one or two were found again through other information requests. So I think, yes, I think we can assume he knew what was going on and was complicit in that. I mean, he sits on various bodies like the Trilateral Commission, which are these big bodies that mix bankers and politicians and members of the intelligence services. So I'm sure he knew very well what was going on. I also think it's worth saying our parliamentarians have done an appalling job on this. They've asked about 2 or 3 questions, I think, in Parliament, and yet they are witnessing one of the great injustices of this century and one of the most dangerous circumstances for freedom of the press. You know, the experts are saying if he is extradited, he will not only go to prison for the rest of his life, he doesn't stand a chance in the court he's going to, these sort of high security court in the USA, but he'll go into a supermax prison. And the effect on other journalists is that they will know if they reveal any US secrets, they can be extradited there. But it will also encourage other states to do this. Already last week, we heard of a Turkish journalist who was editing a paper who's in absentia because he managed to get out to Germany, been sentenced to 27 years in prison for his reporting on what the Turkish state regarded as secret. So I think this will spread and spread. If we do not win this case, we must fight on, and people can join that. They can write to him in prison. They can look at the relevant campaigning websites and start to join some of the activities that we have.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Turkey. It's made me think of 2 things. One is Turkey, of course, is quite fond of its secrets. And second is with the COVID pandemic worldwide, it really is a time when we need facts and information, isn't it? And it's not just the medical side of it. I mean, I'm no medic, but I can't make sense of how COVID happened, really. But afterwards, I think there's going to be tremendous economic upheaval. And when there's economic upheaval, there's always political upheaval. And I'd rather know what they're all up to, I must say. But as you say, it's very, it's all very difficult and designed to stop not only Julian Assange, but also anyone else. I had a couple of comments also coming through now. One from Jahanara Hussain. The politicians are always protected against crimes they commit. Bush and Blair were never questioned. They have the wrong person at Belmarsh. So I think you know, it's very nice to hear sort of support coming from across East London, and also Emmy. I think it's Emmy Butlin. It's a bit of a smudge on my computer. Has posted a link to an article about the CPS destroying evidence. So it's very helpful. Thank you very much for that, Emmy. That's really helping us to piece everything together. And I'll put up as well shortly a link. It's obviously a good time. You've got a few days yet when you can still write to Julian Assange in Belmarsh and send your good wishes to him as he faces this horrendous prospect. I just wanted to pick up one point you made, Maxine, about Starmer, and you know you've sort of said he's not been tackled. Have you had, or has the campaign had, developed any great relationships with people in the Labour Party members, and tried to get Labour Party members to raise this topic in the party, or are there any other political parties that have been helpful in terms of the campaign?
I know that a cross-party, cross-bench group of MPs have asked if they can ask the Justice Ministry if they can speak to Assange by video, and that included Labour, Liberals, I think, and possibly one Tory as well. So that it's a cross-bench thing, but to really fight against the forces we've portrayed, you need a mass of people to take part. It's not too late. Whatever the verdict is on next week, there will be appeals. Things will come out. Justice, in the end, has a way of raising its head and its force, and we found very good support amongst people on the street. Actually, we have a big sign saying "Toot for Assange" when we're on events, and it's deafening sometimes, the number of toots that supporters get. So there's support there, it just needs to be built.
Yes, and getting information out must be part of that. We're beginning to reach the end of our hour now. I told you all it would go very quickly. So I'd just like to sort of go around you and sort of just ask, what question haven't I asked you that you would actually like to answer? So, Bob, is there anything else you'd like to add to what's been said?
I don't think there's anything I'd like to add, but I just want to reinforce how important it is for people to actively support Julian. There's certainly the psychological boost that can provide. The more he appreciates that other journalists are slowly coming out of the woodwork, he's getting more support on social media. That's vitally important. And it's also good that Julian has a partner and 2 children. These are all psychologically protective of Julian, because he's been under unimaginable pressure in Belmarsh. So we mustn't stop the fight, as Maxine said, and you know, it's been great to do my small part just to contribute to your show tonight.
Very happy to have you, Bob. Helen, is there anything you've clearly got a forensic overview here of what's going on? What would you like to add?
So I just wanted to add a couple of points. One is, I think we focus very much on the activities of the United States, but I think also it's worth pointing out that a lot of WikiLeaks revelations refer to particularly the use of US ambassadors to promote the interests of American firms. And I think, you know, from that point of view, it's well worth mentioning, you know, the promotion of the interests of companies like Monsanto, Lockheed Martin, even of Pfizer. And I think that the corporate interests involved in suppressing Assange are also worth emphasising. And if I could just mention that he's been nominated for many prizes, many journalistic prizes, and he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And most recently, in January of this year, a group of German parliamentarians again nominated him, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden for the Nobel Peace Prize. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just quote the summary of why they've nominated these 3 people for the Nobel Peace Prize, because it applies very much to Assange, and it implies very much to the importance of defending WikiLeaks. They say that their actions have exposed the architecture of abuse and war and fortified the architecture of peace. In return, all 3 individuals have been forced to sacrifice the very liberties, rights, and human welfare that they worked so hard to defend. And for that reason, it's very important to carry on campaigning for Assange and thereby for WikiLeaks and for all proper journalism.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. And Maxine, have you anything that you'd like to add? Anything that we've not covered yet?
Well, I noticed it's worth mentioning in terms of the British government that they are shoring up their defences. They're passing the Overseas Operations Bill, which will prevent the prosecution of army and other British military personnel on overseas territories for war crimes. So that's being done, just as they've covered up the British role in torture. That comes out in various of the WikiLeaks. And also to commend the brave young soldier who did a one-man demonstration outside Downing Street against the British role in the war in Yemen. He stood there in his full uniform and demonstrated. And I think that's the kind of courage we need in these times. And it's the courage that people like Julian Assange have displayed.
You make me think of Milan Rai, who I can't remember now at which point it was during the war, but went and had a look at, I think it was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he had some red paint with him, and he thought, the FCO's got blood on its hands. Thought he'd make a graphic representation of that. And again, what a brave man. And he was also prosecuted. But had a lot of support, and it made a difference to the outcome to his prosecution. So I think as an activist and sadly as somebody who for far too many years has heard too many dreadful stories, all I can do is thank you for adding to them, encourage our viewers to, as you say, play a part. You really can help make a difference, and say that within all this there is still hope, because we are still fighting for something. It's not something we can sit back on, because we need to find out what's being done in our name and with our money. You probably didn't think, dear viewer, that there would be a programme at this time of year which didn't mention, or didn't at least concentrate on COVID or Brexit. But while all that takes the headlines, here we are in the small print with something that's important too. So thank you so much for listening. Please, if you've watched this video either live, or I know many of you watch on demand, please share it. Share a link to this video with all your friends and so forth on social media, and let's see if we can get some campaigning doing. So thank you to all my guests, and we're now going to leave you and hopefully see you again in the new year. Thank you for watching, and good night.